Greetings, comrades! The day has come. We have reached the 8th and final level of our Russian conspiracy theory iceberg. It took me more than 2 years to finish it, which is undoubtedly too long. Some theories weren't just conspiratorial enough. Some lost their relevance, and some seem to be more true with each passing day. Ahead lies the 8th level, which contains only the strangest and least known stories. At first, each one will seem like complete nonsense, but take a closer look. So, what do we have today? How did the Red Marshal propose to adopt paganism in the USSR? Why does the Russian elite hire psychics? Who do powerful crime bosses really worship? And why did human life actually originate in a small village near Voronezh? Let's find out. Pharaoh's brown ear. Let's start with some YouTube lunatics. So, what is the Pharaoh's brown ear? It's a phrase that became a meme thanks to this audio clip by Andrei Dyanchenko.
Коричневое ухо фараонов, китовых борозд, на грифах оснащения НЛО с подоплекой зрелости.
In his 8-minute video, Andrei speaks complete nonsense in a drolling voice. It looks like a textbook case of schizophrenia. Grammatically, the sentences are more or less correct and use complex scientific and technical terms, but they're completely devoid of actual meaning. The text itself became a meme, being substituted for the words of famous announcers and personalities. However, the author's story is more interesting. For almost 10 years, Andrei ran several YouTube channels filled with similar monologues that sometimes lasted 2 to 3 hours straight, and were always accompanied by illustrations like these. Photos from movies, some patterns and collages. Imagine how much time he spent trying to get his message across to us. But the most puzzling thing is the text itself. The fact is that it all sounds almost meaningful. It seems that at any moment you will begin to understand it all, realize how our universe works. There is even a theory that Dyanchenko is an AI or an alien whose language we cannot yet decipher. But if you tune your brain to this frequency correctly, you will understand how UFOs control our DNA and the very structure of reality. You will decipher this message from a higher intelligence. Want to try? Cherep-Spiridovich. So, why are we interested in this general of the Russian Imperial Army, a part of his last name, Cherep, literally skull? Artur Ivanovich Cherep-Spiridovich was a major general in the Navy, the owner of a substantial fortune and a member of the monarchist organization Russian Assembly. In short, he was a wealthy and influential man in Tsarist Russia. He wasn't a nobleman, but he could have been well informed. In 1912, however, he was for some reason stripped of his right to wear a uniform. After the revolution, he immigrated to the United States, eventually passing away in 1926 under unclear circumstances from gas poisoning. Coincidentally, this happened just a couple of months after the publication of what is probably his most famous book with the telling title The Secret World Government or the Hidden Hand. So, according to Cherep-Spiridovich, all power in the world is concentrated in the hands of about 300 families. Jewish, of course, but with a mixture of Mongolian blood. The demise of Russia is part of this family's 1,000-year plan to seize global power. In fact, almost all wars, revolutions and assassinations of monarchs, from Julius Caesar to Franz Ferdinand and Nicholas II, were the work of the same organization. Needless to say, Cherep-Spiridovich modestly considered himself the savior of the world. He wanted to unite 200 million Slavs and save the white race. He claimed to have a gift of clairvoyance, predicting World War I and warning of World War II in the 1920s. He claimed to have personally warned the Serbian king, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich and Nicholas II about their impending murders in letters, but no one listened to him. Therefore, he decided to write the work of his life and reveal the truth to a wide audience, not just rulers. On October 22, 1926, Cherep-Spiridovich was found dead in a hotel room on Staten Island. Initially, the New York Times reported that his death was caused by accidental suffocation from a gas leak. However, after a 9-day investigation, the authorities concluded that his death was most likely a suicide. Naturally, this version was immediately picked up and published by almost all the newspapers of the time. What nationality were the owners of all these newspapers? You can guess for yourself. Yazidi Satanist thieves-in-law. The Yazidis, the indigenous population of Kurdistan, are one of the most closed ethno-religious groups in the world. Unlike many other religions, one cannot convert to Yazidism, one must be born into it. Traditions and customs are passed down by word of mouth, which is why little documentation about them exists. Naturally, such a large and closed group, with an estimated 1.5 million members, attracts all kinds of legends and myths. Okay, but why Satanists? It's simple. The Yazidis believe in one god and 7 angels, the chief of whom is Melek Taus, who is depicted as a peacock. According to one legend, Melek turned away from God out of pride, refusing to obey the created man. Do you know who did the same in the Abrahamic religions? Lucifer. Muslim and Christian critics of Yazidism often equate Malak-Ta with the fallen angel Iblis, aka Shaitan, aka Satan. In Old Russian, the Yazidis were called devil worshippers. But these are religious details, let's not get into them. I am not going to argue about who is faithful and who is unfaithful. We are interested in a peculiar statistical anomaly, a disproportionately high number of ethnic Yazidis among the elite of the Russian criminal underworld, known as the thieves-in-law. This trend began during the Soviet era. If you look up the names of the most powerful modern thieves-in-law in Russia, you will find 2 main figures: Ded Hassan, Aslan Asayan, and Shakro Молодой, Zakhar Kalashov. They control the criminal underworld of the post-Soviet region for decades. Both are Kurdish Yazidis. Of course, this could be a mere coincidence. Acquaintances born in the same city and from the same social background somehow managed to take over the post-Soviet criminal world and began surrounding themselves with people from their own clan. But what if the Russian criminal world is actually a secret Satanist religious order? According to this theory, the thieves-in-law rules, renunciation of family, asceticism and strict hierarchy are copied from ancient Yazidi priest caste laws. The coronation of a thief is not just an opportunity to extort money from those who want to join the prison mafia. It is a mystical initiation and the sale of one's soul to the egregore. The constant collection of money for thieves' affairs among prisoners is not just a tribute, but a ritual gathering of energy and material goods to appease the master, Melek Taus. This order's mystical nature explains why Hassan survived numerous assassination attempts and ruled the empire until old age. Aslan Usoev's life was cut short by a sniper's bullet in 2013. Perhaps this meant that his contract with the Dark Forces had expired. The death of the High Priest marked a change of era, not only in crime, but also on a metaphysical level in Russia. Rose of the World. In your opinion, can Soviet prisons inspire creativity? I mean, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was inspired to write the Gulag Archipelago, for which he won the Nobel Prize, but he wrote the book after his release. In contrast, writer Danil Andreev wrote his life's work within the walls of Vladimir Central Prison, perhaps Russia's most legendary penal institution. Andreev was a unique writer. He came from a very creative family and was the son of writer Leonid Andreev. Maxim Gorky was his godfather, and Ivan Bunin, Alexander Scriabin and Fyodor Shalyapin were frequent visitors to his home during his childhood. However, none of Andreev's works were published before his death. 0. First he studied, then worked as a proofreader and a graphic designer, then the war. There was no time for literature. He became famous precisely because of his imprisonment. In 1947, on the basis of a tip-off, he was accused of forming an anti-Soviet group, engaging in anti-Soviet agitation, and harboring terrorist intentions. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 19 of his relatives and close friends were also imprisoned, and the Ministry of State Security destroyed all of his written works. What possibly could this creative young man have written that was so horrible? Perhaps precisely what he would describe in The Rose of the World while already in prison. Experts define The Rose of the World as a meta-philosophical treatise, emphasizing that the book is unique and has no exact counterparts in mystical and visionary literature. Its closest analogues are Dante's Divine Comedy and the Birth Giver of God Walk Through Torment. However, Andreev's mythological, cultural and philosophical system is not limited to a single doctrine. While in prison, he allegedly gained spiritual vision and began to travel through the layers of reality, of which there are hundreds, communicating with higher beings. According to this theory, our Earth, in Rov, is just one layer of the Brahmvatura, or system of worlds, called Shadhanakar. Everything that happens in our history, such as wars and revolutions, is merely a shadow of the immense battles occurring in other dimensions between the forces of light and demons. He also coined the term Gavach, which refers to the energy of suffering that serves as food for numerous demons. Andreev introduced the concept of Vitzraors, giant demonic monsters that feed on the energy of human suffering and rule over states. The Russian Vitzraors are called Zhrugar. There were three Zhrugar. The first was born in the first half of the 14th century. His victory over the Mongolian Vitzraor was expressed in Rov by the victory of Dmitry Donskoy in the Battle of Kulikovo and resulted in the Mongols being repelled. The second Zhrugar is associated with the Romanov dynasty. He devoured his father's heart at the beginning of the 17th century. In our world, this event corresponded with the change of dynasties and the time of troubles. The third Zhrugar is associated with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the USSR. He devoured his father's heart in 1917. In the Rose of the World system, Stalin was not just a tyrant, but an imprint of Zhrugar, his instrument. Andreev described how Stalin would fall into a trance during his famous night vigils until 5 AM in order to communicate directly with the demon and receive power and orders from him. Allegedly, the mass executions and repression since the 1930s were not politically motivated, but rather to feed Zhrugar with Gavach. When there was not enough, World War II began. After it, repressions continued. The Cold War was a battle between Zhrugar and Stabing, the demon of the United States. Andreev describes hundreds of hellish worlds beneath us, ranging from a world where souls preoccupied with everyday matters end up, to a black analog of St. Petersburg in another dimension where black suns shine. But what is the Rose of the World? Andreev predicted that after the era of tyranny falls, all religions and states would unite into one spiritual brotherhood to prevent the coming of the Antichrist. That brotherhood would be called the Rose of the World. However, before that happens, humanity will face the rule of the Prince of Darkness. We just need to be patient a little longer. How soon do you think that will be? Neo-paganism and Tukhachevsky's reforms. Let's continue with strange religious theories. I have already mentioned Radnoverie, a neo-pagan movement that gained popularity in Russia in the 1990s. You might wonder what a Red Army Marshal shot in 1937 has to do with this. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky went down in history as a champion of innovative methods of warfare. He initiated the development of the first radio-controlled tanks, unmanned aircraft, and homing missiles in the USSR. However, some believe that he was an innovator not only in military affairs, but also religious matters. The fact is that, according to some recollections, the future Marshal of the USSR was an ardent pagan. In fact, during World War I, he was a prisoner of war in Germany, sharing a cell with French journalist Rémy Roure. This journalist wrote that Tukhachevsky once made an ugly idol of the Slavic god Perun out of colored cardboard and breadcrumbs and prayed to it, burned candles in front of it, and talked about how Christianity and Judaism were religions of weakness imposed on Russia and needed to be destroyed. Tukhachevsky admitted that he hated Prince Vladimir the Great, who was allegedly responsible for Russia falling under the influence of Western civilization after its baptism. Okay, maybe the Frenchman misunderstood something and exaggerated it. But one of Tukhachevsky's acquaintances, Leonid Sabaneyev, also recalled that after the revolution in 1919, already a commander of the army, Tukhachevsky prepared a memorandum for the Council of People's Commissars. In it, the member of the Revolutionary Military Council tried to convince the Bolsheviks that paganism should be made the state religion of the RSFSR. We must preserve our crude paganism, our barbarism, Tukhachevsky said. But this idea was rejected as most Bolshevik leaders formally adhered to atheism. Tukhachevsky resigned himself to this and began moving up the army career ladder, setting a course to reform the Red Army. Tukhachevsky biographer Yulia Kantor dismisses this episode as a joke, believing that Tukhachevsky did not mean it seriously. But there is another version. It is known that in all of his positions, Tukhachevsky considered his main task to be preparing the Red Army for a future war, encouraging the militarization of the Soviet economy. While many believe he foresaw a confrontation with Germany and wanted to prepare the country, conspiracy theories claim his true goal was to transform the Red Army into not just a military machine, but an order of new barbarians. Tukhachevsky allegedly planned to overthrow Stalin, whom he saw as a seminarian representing a distorted orthodox biblical matrix of power, and build an aggressive pagan empire focused on war and the cult of power, completely devoid of morality. However, Stalin recognized the threat in time and destroyed the rival cult. This explains Tukhachevsky's cruelty, evident in his suppression of domestic rebellions such as the Tambov uprising, using horrific methods including chemical weapons. He was not a mere punisher, he was a priest of an ancient cult of violence. Psychics in Russia's top elite. I have already mentioned that shortly before and after the fall of the USSR, the Kremlin allegedly sometimes resorted to the services of psychics. Suffice it to recall military unit number 10,003, responsible for working with the paranormal. Then there's Georgy Rogozin, Yeltsin's advisor, who was also part of level 1 of my iceberg. Another example is Boris Ratnikov, a retired FSB Major General who was part of the president's inner circle in the late 1990s. These are not just some local lunatics, but people with access to the nuclear button. They claim to have developed methods for entering the information field of the Earth, the noosphere. Sitting in their offices in the Kremlin, they allegedly connected to the subconscious of world leaders. In 2006, Ratnikov claimed in an interview with the Russian newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta, incidentally the official newspaper of the Russian government, that they had entered the astral plane, scanned the brain of the US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and found a pathological hatred of Slavs, and the idea that Siberia is too rich to belong to Russia alone. Whether this is true, no one knows, but rumors about the Kremlin's love of mystical rituals have circulated for years. Until recently, Sergei Shoigu was considered the primary psychic who introduced Tuvan traditions such as rejuvenating baths made from boiled marl antlers and trips by leaders to the taiga for spiritist seances. Incidentally, there was a Yakut shaman who recently decided to walk from Yakutsk to Moscow to cleanse the Kremlin of evil forces and turned it into a public campaign. He was intercepted, declared insane, and is still being held in psychiatric hospital. But what if the Yakut shaman knew something about what the Tuvan shamans do in the Kremlin? What if the elites are mostly afraid of magic and react so painfully to it precisely because they practice it themselves? Kremlin sleepers. And let's continue with people possessing supernatural abilities inside the Kremlin. Allegedly, other, even more secretive units worked alongside the soldiers of military unit number 10,003. The Kremlin had an entire squad of so-called sleepers at its disposal. A sleeper is someone who can read another person's thoughts by entering their consciousness. But not just penetrating, they can hack into one's memory, finding even what the person has forgotten, and perform hard coding. Unlike hypnosis, which can be reversed, a sleeper's code completely reprograms the personality. Battalion 14 made of sleepers was first used in the wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya. Its fighters did not shoot. Rather, they disabled the will of enemy commanders and forced them to surrender or make mistakes. All this was described by the very same Boris Ratnikov. Allegedly, sleepers were trained in special laboratories. They took people who were predisposed to the paranormal and pushed their abilities to the limit, teaching them to control their gifts. There was a huge global system in place to search for people with paranormal abilities throughout the Soviet Union and turn them into weapons. The training process itself could take decades. On average, a sleeper agent could carry out about 6 operations before their consciousness was reset, rendering them useless. However, it would be wrong to think that only the KGB had those sleepers. The first sleeper agent was reportedly obtained by the German Secret Service in the 1930s and first used in 1943. He was captured by British troops, and information about this phenomenon then reached the KGB and the CIA. There is evidence that terrorist organizations use them as well. Some articles cite the Boston Marathon bombings as a specific example of sleepers at work. The theory is that the Tsarnaev brothers were ordinary individuals who were activated remotely. Their strange behavior and lack of logic can be explained by the fact that they were bio-robots controlled by an operator sitting far away. They didn't understand what they were doing. They were just following the code programmed into them. Voronezh Kostyonki, the birthplace of mankind. Alright, enough with the psychics and the Kremlin. Now let's move on to a more global issue. Where did humanity originate? Africa? Or perhaps in the beautiful village of Kostyonki in Russia's Voronezh region? Okay, maybe not humanity, but European civilization. This is precisely the claim made in 2007 by American archaeology professor John Hoffaker. Why? Ancient human settlements dating back approximately 40 to 45,000 years have been discovered in the village of Kostyonki. This makes them the oldest known habitation sites of modern humans in Europe. Based on these findings, Mr. Hoffaker theorized that humans arrived in Europe from the Caucasus via the right bank of the Don River, rather than from Turkey via the Balkans as was previously believed. There is reason to believe that the Kostyonki area was home to one of the earliest proto-cities with a population of 200 to 300 people. Moreover, it was there that valuable new abilities of consciousness and practice were acquired, marking the beginning of human civilization. The local Homo sapiens, who lived mainly by hunting and gathering, had already mastered many crafts and showed elements of artistic creativity. This is an interesting fact, not a conspiracy theory, but rather a subject for scientific debate about how modern humans settled in Europe. But what if we take it a step further and assume that this is where all of humanity originated? This is the view held, for example, by Anatoly Klosov, a biochemist and author of the concept of DNA genealogy. In his publications, Klosov traces the origins of the Slavs or Russians back 700,000 years, and asserts that they are the progenitors of all humanity. According to Klosov, the farther ancient people moved from the Russian plain, the more they degenerated. According to Klosov's concept, he traces the R1a haplogroup, claiming it is the mark of the true Aryan Slavs. Kostyonki, the Russian Eden and capital of the ancient Russian plain, is where the ancestors of all Indo-Europeans came from. It is worth noting that along with traces of humans, mammoth bones have also been found in Kostyonki. Supporters of this theory believe that the ancient Rus did not hunt mammoths for food, but bred them as livestock. Their giant bones were used as building materials for ancient megacities. Some researchers claim to find microscopic inscriptions in Russian, such as Mara, Temple of Yara, and Rus on the Paleolithic stones of Kostyonki. They argue that this proves the Cyrillic alphabet existed tens or thousands of years before Cyril and Methodius. Some associate Kostyonki with Hyperborea. Allegedly, after a climatic catastrophe at the North Pole, the surviving Hyperboreans descended to Voronezh and founded a new civilization there. In essence, however, it all boils down to this: we are the Great Rus, and you are merely there to follow our lead. Lenin is Saoshyant. If you are unfamiliar with the concept of Saoshyant, don't worry, I wasn't either. It comes from Zoroastrianism, where it refers to the savior who will save all of humanity. More precisely, there will be 3 Saoshyants. The first two must restore the teachings given by Zarathustra. The third has not yet to come. He will come at the end of time, resurrect the dead, and perform the Frasha Kireti, marking the final victory of good over evil. I can't tell you who the third Saoshyant will be, but I can tell you the name of the second, Vladimir Lenin. And the first is a combination of Marx and Engels. This is how a small group of Zoroastrian communists sees the world. They believe that communist doctrine emerged 2,500 years ago when Zarathustra brought it to the people. The final battle between good and evil, according to them, is the world revolution that Lenin so eagerly sought. The forces of evil are the forces of capitalism, they say, poisoning humanity with their venom. Additionally, there is a widespread legend that during his lifetime Vladimir Lenin was referred to as Mahatma in Tibet, a title given only to superhuman personalities. Supposedly, local monks recognized Vladimir Ilyinch's extraterrestrial origin this way. Well, his body is still waiting. Perhaps one day he will rise for the final battle with evil. Super soldiers of the Soviet army. Who will help Vladimir Ilyich in his final battle? Of course, the super soldiers that the Soviet Union has been training in secret laboratories for decades. And they didn't use just one method to do this, but a combination of several. First, let's review the attempts you already know about. For example, the Sukhumi experiment, in which the mad scientist Ilya Ivanov attempted to crossbreed a monkey and a human. Imagine if he had succeeded in creating a new invincible human race, one that is insensitive to pain, unpretentious about food, and physically super strong. But this was not the only attempt. According to American historian Jeff Strasberg, the USSR had a program from 1936 to 1941 to create cyborgs. Allegedly, in 1945, the Americans raided a Nazi laboratory in Germany, where they discovered the mutilated corpses of Soviet soldiers. Titanium bones and mechanisms replacing joints had been implanted in their bodies. Initially, the Americans thought these were results of horrific experiments conducted by German scientists. However, during interrogations, they discovered that the scientists were merely studying samples captured from the USSR. About 300 volunteers reportedly participated in the Soviet program, in which their limb bones were partially replaced with titanium prostheses that were virtually invulnerable to bullets. Electrodes were also implanted in their brains to block pain centers. However, such an operation had a side effect: numerous mental disorders that caused the cyborgs to periodically become completely uncontrollable. Most of the soldiers were concentrated in the Brest fortress, which was besieged at the beginning of World War II. It was thanks to these soldiers that the fortress was defended so successfully. After June 1941, the scientists involved in the project were transferred to other facilities, and almost all of them died in combat. Some believe that this was no accident. The fate of the surviving titanium soldiers is unknown. All information about the project was seized and classified at the end of the war. Need more proof? In 1994, Sergei Konovalenko, a doctor from Vitebsk, discovered human remains in an old cemetery on the city outskirts. One of the graves had been washed away by the river, exposing its contents. Sergei was surprised to see that the skeletal remains were connected to metal prostheses with hinges. The prostheses clearly replaced human bones, not just arms and legs, but others as well. Each prosthesis bore a star with a hammer and sickle beneath it, along with the inscription Kharkov 0539 RSC. But even this was not the last attempt. Allegedly, in the 1960s, the special services realized the futility of crossbreeding and implantation and abandoned them, turning instead to experiments with psychotropic substances that increase the endurance and performance of the human body. According to some sources, during the war in Afghanistan, certain soldiers were doped with special psychotropic substances. They were intended to enhance the soldiers' endurance, increase their aggression, and eliminate their need for sleep and food. According to the same rumors, however, the drugs had a predominantly negative effect. But what if that's just what we were told? The Shamakhan Queen was the queen of the castrati. It's been a while since we've looked for hidden messages in children's fairy tales. Let's do that now. At first glance, Alexander Pushkin's fairy tale The Golden Cockerel seems primitive. A parable about an ungrateful Tsar, wise man, and broken promises. The sage offers the Tsar protection from his enemies in the form of a rooster, and in exchange the Tsar promises him anything he desires. I would like to draw your attention to the ending of the tale. A fairy tale is a lie, but there's a hint in it, a lesson for good fellows. What hint or lesson is being referred to here? Perhaps the key figure is the Queen of Shamakhan, the seductress who leads King Dadon and his sons to their doom. The key to unraveling this mystery is the sage's demand that the king give him the mysterious Queen of Shamakhan in exchange for the magic cockerel. In Pushkin's original, the king declared that there was a limit to everything and that he was ready to give many things, but he would not give the girl, especially since the old skapets had no use for her. Wait, a skapets? So the sage was a eunuch. But why would he need a young beauty? This amazes even Dadon. In his anger, he kills the old man and then himself meets his death from the golden cockerel for breaking the promise. Psychologist and cultural expert Alexander Etkind offered an explanation for all this. According to his analysis, the Queen of Shamakhan hailed from Shamahi, an ancient city in the Caucasus region of modern-day Azerbaijan, which was a common exile destination for Russian sectarians. Do you remember the largest sect in the 19th century Russia? That's right, the Skaptsi, literally the castrati, very powerful, extremely influential. Now look at how Tsar Dadon refers to the old man in his address. He calls him a skapets. In other words, the wise old man was a subject of the cunning queen who lured the Tsar into her trap. It was all her plot from the very beginning. So that was the hint lesson in this fairy tale. Perhaps Pushkin wanted to send a coded message to the upper class that their fascination with the Skaptsi, the sect was very fashionable at the time Pushkin wrote this fairy tale, would lead to a disaster. The sage's death at the king's hands is Pushkin's hope that the monarchy will crush the dangerous sect. However, in the end, the sect, symbolically represented by the rooster and the queen, kills the monarchy. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petr Ilich, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.